Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. We're going to start the presentation in a minute or two. We'll just wait for a few more people to log on. All right, well, good afternoon everyone. Welcome to today's webinar presented by the Canadian Water Resources Association. Today, CWRA has partnered with the International Institute for Sustainable Development Experimental Lakes Area to present a general overview of the climate change research they've been doing. Before we get started though, I'd like to point out a few things in order to make sure the webinar runs smoothly. The presentation will run for approximately 40 minutes. Please at any time type any comments or questions you may have during the presentation or immediately after in the questions pane in the GoToWebinar control panel. I've typed a short welcome message to get you started. All questions will be held and asked on your behalf at the end of the presentation. A PDF file of today's slides will be distributed in a follow-up email along with a short survey. We appreciate your feedback. Our presenter today is Dr. Scott Higgins. He brings extensive experience and diverse skills to his position as research scientist. Prior to joining the IISD, he worked for Fisheries and Oceans Canada as research scientist for the Experimental Lakes area, focusing on algal ecology, primary production, climate change, and the effects of invasive species on freshwater ecosystems. As a graduate student and postdoc fellow at the University of Waterloo, he researched water quality in the Laurentian Great Lakes and Lake Malawi, Africa, and also on the ecological effects of invasive species on aquatic ecosystems for the University of Wisconsin's Center for Limnology. His research has been published in numerous ecology and freshwater science journals, reports, and books. He has presented his research findings at numerous scientific conferences and given guest lectures at many universities. Dr. Higgins' research has received awards from Fisheries and Oceans Canada, the International Association for Great Lakes Research, and the Canadian International Development Agency. The information discussed today is based on a 5-part series on climate change in the IISD ELA Headwaters newsletter, the link to which you can be seen in the chat window. Today, Dr. Higgins will provide a general introduction to the ELA and the work being done on the effects of climate change to boreal streams and lake waters. He will describe ELA's long-term monitoring program, examine how regional changes in climate over the past 47 years have influenced stream discharge and chemistry, and a variety of lake properties. He will also provide information on how the regional climate is changing, the responses of stream and lake properties to those changes, and an overview of some of the knowledge gaps and potential for collaborations and future research. With that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Higgins and hand over presenter rights at this time.
Okay, thanks, Jody. Welcome. I hope everyone's doing well. As Jody said, my name is Scott Higgins. I'm a research scientist with the IISD Experimental Lakes Area, or ELA for short. We're a nonprofit research-based organization, and our focus is on freshwater research. So I'd like to start the talk off with a question, and that is, how will climate change impact boreal lakes and streams? It's not a rhetorical question. It's a question that we've been asking ourselves, and a lot of other people have been asking for years. And so we're not going to answer that question in its totality today, but what I hope to do is to provide with you a structure of how we are looking at that problem and provide some results, at least to our original data, what it's saying. Now, it's quite possible and even likely that I framed that question quite poorly. And perhaps what I should have asked was, what's the impact of climate change on watersheds? Because our lakes and rivers are so tightly linked to their terrestrial landscapes. Now, the importance of these linkages has certainly been recognized by others, and that is the focus of this quote, which brings up a second important point. The effects of climate change on freshwater is much more than the direct effects of temperature. It's the effects of precipitation, it's fire, it's changes in productivity and degradation in the landscape, invasive species, and a host of other things. So if there's at least 2 points to take away from this talk, it would be that the fate of our lakes and rivers are tightly tied to the fate of their watersheds. And second, that the impacts of climate change are more than just the direct effects of temperature. So what you're seeing here is on your screen is an aerial photograph of the boreal forest near our research station. There's a road winding its way through the lakes and the forest, but otherwise the ecosystem appears relatively pristine. Now, the other thing to notice is the number of lakes. Surface water represents a significant component of the boreal forest ecosystem, and that's true for the Canadian boreal zone in general, which has over 2 million lakes, which is a truly amazing amount of fresh water and very unique globally. Now, the boreal forest represents the world's largest ecozone, but depending on where you live in Canada, you might not even know it was there. So what I've done is indicated in the small blue dots the major urban centers in Canada. And what you can see is that most of our population does not live in the boreal zone or even close to the boreal zone. So despite its size, it's easily overlooked. Now, as I've said, the boreal zone is the largest ecozone on the planet. It covers approximately 11% of the planet's land surface area. In Canada, the boreal forest represents about over 50% of our land area. And it's an incredible storehouse of lakes and rivers and wetlands. So over 50% of the world's lakes are located in Canada's boreal zone and over 25% of the world's wetlands. So it's a very unique ecosystem, or ecozone, I should say. It also plays, because of its size, it plays an incredibly important role in global carbon cycling as well. And that's the forest, the lakes and the trees, and the wetlands all together are playing a very important role. Now, if we look back into the past, in this figure you can see temperature reconstructions for the boreal shield zone in Canada as we emerged from the last ice age. So it's quite evident from these reconstructions that air temperatures during our most recent 150 years or so, since industrialization, have diverged from those during the previous 7,000 or 8,000 years. And it's for this reason that this latest period, this latest 150 or so years since industrialization, that climate scientists are trying to have it recognized as the Anthropocene era. So things now are quite a bit different than they have been for quite a long time. Now, looking into the future, many of you will be familiar with the most recent IPCC global temperature projections. The figure on the left is the RCP, or Relative Concentration Pathway 2.6 scenario, which essentially represents what was agreed upon as a target at the recent Paris Climate Summit. On the right is the RCP 8.5 scenario, which represents the business as usual scenario. So that's the trajectory that we are on now. And some have argued that current trends would actually push us past this trajectory, but it still remains a useful benchmark to examine the possible impacts of climate change. Now, I think an important thing to take away from this figure is not just the difference between the two scenarios, but also the spatial differences within each scenario. So as you can see, as you move towards the poles, the projected temperature change becomes much more severe. And so we're located in those temperate latitudes where the impacts of projected impacts of climate change are expected to be large. Now, I provided some information at the bottom that regional downscale projections for our region suggest 1.7 to 3 degrees Celsius temperature change by 2050, up to close to a 5-degree temperature change by 2070 compared to the 1986 to 2005 levels. So our region of Canada is expected to undergo severe or large changes in temperature in the coming decades. But as I said at the outset, climate change isn't just about temperature. The global water cycle has the potential to be highly impacted, but there's also considerable uncertainty and lack of agreement between models, particularly in the business as usual scenario. Now, for Canada, the precipitation projections that I've seen have suggested a really strong divide between what's going to happen in Western Canada and what's going to happen in Eastern Canada. So as a generalization, Western Canada is projected to have wetter springs and drier summers, while Eastern Canada is projected to have similar or more precipitation throughout the year. Now, the IISD ELA operates a research station in a remote and pristine area of northwestern Ontario. And so you can see in the upper left-hand corner of your screen, you can see where the ELA is located in Ontario. It's down a 30-kilometer logging road, which is closed to public access, and the lakes are closed to public access as well. So it's a very pristine area that's largely unimpacted by human activities. It was opened in 1968 by the federal government of Canada with the purpose of informing policy on eutrophication. Now, the facility was transferred to IISD in May of 2013, and it continues to operate its research programs. So we're still in business. It's quite a modern facility with excellent accommodations and lab facilities. Not only do we utilize our research station, but a great number of visiting scientists and students use the research station as well. So if you have any interest in research in the boreal zone, we would very much encourage you to talk to us and about the possibilities. So the ELA is probably best known for our ability to conduct whole ecosystem experiments. So as I said, we've been in operation since 1969, and there's been over 50 whole ecosystem manipulations conducted to date. And they generally fall in three areas, physical, chemical, or biological. Now, some of the physical manipulations that have occurred are the construction of artificial reservoirs to look at how they impact greenhouse gas emissions or methylmercury. And the two pictures in the bottom left of your screen sort of give an indication of that. There's a flooded wetland that's there, and that was the Lake 979 experiment. We have water diversion experiments that are currently ongoing. There's been a number of chemical or experiments that have involved chemical additions. ELA was actually started to examine the role of carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus in controlling lake eutrophication. And lake eutrophication is actually the #1 water quality problem for lakes around the world. There's also been experiments on acid rain. There's been experiments where we've added endocrine disrupting chemicals to lakes. So these are the chemicals found in birth control pills that are leaving our sewage treatment plants untreated with potential impacts on fish and other biota. We've done experiments on metals, including an experiment on nanosilver that just recently wrapped up, which was led by researchers from Trent University. There's been a number of experiments on biological components, including aquaculture and trophic cascades. So there's been a real diverse range of whole ecosystem experiments that have occurred. And like I said, that's really what people know the ELA for. What we're probably less well known for is the extensive data sets that we've been collecting as part of our long-term ecological research program, or LTER for short. So it's quite rare anywhere in the world that such detailed information on so many ecosystem components is collected at the same place. And it's also very rare that it's been collected for such a long time period. So we've been collecting this data since 1969. We readily share this data with external researchers. So if you see something today that you find interesting, please feel free to contact us and we can talk about data sharing. Now, there's another component of our program, and we've always had a component where we trained undergraduate and graduate students, but in our new reincarnation as a nonprofit organization, we are now more fully embracing the outreach and education components as an important plank in our strategic plan. So this component is fairly new, but it's growing, and if you want to find out more or keep up with the latest developments, I encourage you to visit our website and sign up for our e-newsletter. And so that should be, the e-newsletter is located on our website. You can find it, the link located on the screen. So here's a list. What you're seeing here is a list of our ongoing climate projects. So as you can see, almost all the projects involve external collaborators, and they cover a wide range of topics, and those collaborators come from a wide range of organizations. Now, what I wanted to try to get across with this diagram is that almost all of these projects tie back in some way, shape, or form to our LTER program. And we consider this LTER program that we have to be the core program of our research facility and really operate as the backbone of our research. So I want to take some time today to describe what our LTER program is, the type of data that we collect, before actually getting into some of the results. And I did notice, I did put a question mark down in one of the project boxes, and the reason is that there are obviously, although we have a number of ongoing projects, there's obviously a lot of gaps. And I'm hoping that you might identify some of those gaps as we go through the talk today and suggest how we can improve our monitoring program or interests that you have in collaborating to improve that program. So our LTER program was designed to collect data from three major components. We have meteorology, watersheds, and lakes. Now it's important to note that our organization is primarily focused on lakes, and because of that, there's probably a lot of information or data gaps in the other two areas. But we collect the information in those in the meteorology and the watersheds that pertain directly to lakes. So if you're interested in long-term effects of climate change on forest conditions, for example, or soil conditions, that's not something we're currently monitoring, although it is something we potentially could. So what I'm going to go through today is this program. I'm going to talk about each of these components, and I'm going to give a few examples. But first, let me describe the program in general. Now, in terms of collaborations, we've actually had a long-term collaboration with Environment Canada since 1969, where we have co-operated a meteorological site at our station. That site actually feeds into regional and national weather reports and forecasts. So when you watch your weather reports on television or hear them on the radio, that information may be influenced by our weather station. Now, and the other thing that it does, it's part of what's called the CATMON program, and that's the Canadian Air and Precipitation Monitoring Network. Now, that network is designed to collect additional information on air pollutants such as mercury and acid rain, and that data is retained by Environment Canada. And so you can find out more about that program, and if you're interested in that data, you can contact Environment Canada directly. So we also collect additional information for our own purposes, such as solar insolation, so photosynthetically active radiation and total solar radiation. We collect information on evaporation, and importantly, we collect information on the chemistry of the precipitation, whether it's wet fall or dry fall, that's falling onto our lakes and watersheds. So in that way, by knowing if it's nutrient chemistry, for example, we can do complete mass balances in our lakes. So we know how much nutrients are falling on the watersheds and directly on the lake surface, and we can calculate a complete mass balance. Now, since we're known as the experimental lakes area, it's probably not surprising that we collect a lot of information on lakes. What is surprising is the breadth of our sampling effort and that we have maintained a continuous record for nearly 5 decades. So we have 5 pristine reference lakes that have been monitored for different lengths of time, the shortest being about 25 years and the longest being 46 years, so all the way back to 1969. The degree of data collection is extensive and includes biweekly collection of most basic limnological parameters. And we have an on-site chemistry laboratory where we analyze perishable samples within hours of collection, and we store non-perishable samples for later analysis. Now, our biological program is also quite extensive and unique. Phytoplankton and zooplankton are identified to species, and both abundance and biomass are determined. So this is done through microscopy. It's a lot of effort, but we believe it's quite valuable, and that actually will come out in this presentation. And I'll give the example of phytoplankton. You know, there's a lot of places where phytoplankton biomass is measured using pigments such as chlorophyll, but algae can manipulate their pigment contents based on their environmental conditions, and that's actually what we believe is occurring as a response to climate change. So it's very good that we have the direct estimates of biomass. So we also put a lot of effort into our fish program, and we use mark and recapture methods for larger fish and catch per unit efforts for smaller fish such as saprintids. Wherever possible, we use non-lethal methods to estimate fish populations. And because these lakes are close to recreational fishing, we can look at long-term patterns free of that top-down pressure. Now, these non-lethal methods are also really important for us because you have to imagine that these lakes are small, and in some cases, the fish populations are relatively small. In some of our lakes, we estimate that there's only 400 to 500 adult lake trout in these lakes. And so you could imagine if we were moving 20 or 30 lake trout every year, it wouldn't take very long before our sampling efforts started to actually impact the population itself. So we use non-lethal methods wherever possible. We also have a hydrology monitoring program that consists of weirs, lake levels, and rain gauges that are distributed around our research site. And the main component of this program is it's designed to understand how water is flowing through the lakes. So as I said, we're pretty lake focused, so our weirs are located on lake outflows primarily, and we have a number of lake level gauges. And the distance between these, you sort of see 2 groupings of dots there. The meteorological site that we have is quite close to Lake 239 at the bottom. And the grouping of dots north is about 10 kilometers away. And we have some rain gauges up there as well, because we found that even though it's fairly close, that precipitation during the summer period can be quite spotty with local rainstorms. And so in order to do a better job at doing mass balances and understanding the chemical influxes to lakes, we need to have rain gauges in different areas. So that's the reason for that. Now, we recognize that we can't measure everything everywhere, and so what we've done is taken one lake and its watershed and studied it in detail. Now, the lake that you're seeing here is Lake 239, or it's called Rawson Lake, and it's our main reference lake, and it has data going back to 1969. So it's located adjacent to our research station and about 1 kilometer or so away from our meteorological station. It has 3 inflowing streams that drain approximately 70% of the catchment, and a short outflow stream, all of which have weirs and are monitoring flow at 15-minute intervals during the ice-free season. Actually at the outflow, it's measured all year long. It's heated, and the reason is that although the inflows dry up during the winter, when there's ice cover, the compaction from the ice actually pushes down on the water and squeezes water out the outflow. So we continue to monitor that through the winter period. So water chemistry is conducted on these streams bi-weekly, or actually, it's actually weekly, which in combination with precipitation allows us to do a very tight mass balance of this watershed. Okay, so what I've done so far has provided a background of what our LTER program is and how it's organized. And what I'd like to do now is provide some examples of the types of data that we're collecting and some of the results that we're seeing. So I think the first question that we'd usually look at is related to temperature. And the big question is, everyone always asks, is it getting warmer? And the answer is absolutely yes, it is. Mean annual air temperatures at our site are increasing by about ½ a degree per decade, and so over 2 degrees since 1970. So air temperatures are rising quite quickly and quite much faster than the global average. Now, the figures that you're seeing in front of you are actually displaying the same data, and I just want to take a little bit of time to describe them because the approaches will come up on future slides as well. The top figure is simply mean annual air temperature over time, so from 1970 to 2015. The bottom figure is what's called a temperature anomaly graph. So what it is, it's the mean annual air temperature in any particular year divided by the long-term average. So what you're seeing here is if the value or the bar is below 0, that means that the mean annual air temperature is below the long-term average. And if it's above the 0 line or green, it's above the long-term average. So it's just a useful way to visually examine the data. And for air temperature, or mean annual air temperature, it's quite clear that it's rising. You can also see that it's variable between years. So air temperatures in our region are warming, but there is a big but. If you were only to look at the mean annual air temperatures, you would only get part of the story. And that's because they hide a large amount of the seasonal dynamics. So what you're seeing here is a graph that breaks down the temperature change from the earliest decade in our data set, the 1970 to 1980 period, to 2000 and 2015 period. So the 10-year period at the start of our data set and the 10-year period at the end of our data set. And it's looking at the mean annual temperature change for each month. So what you see here is that the largest changes that are occurring are during the winter and the shoulder seasons. And in fact, December has the largest temperature change, and it's about 6 degrees since 1970, or 1.3 degrees Celsius per decade. So these are huge changes that are occurring during the winter period. But if you look during the summer, the sort of the May, June, July period, there's actually no significant changes in summer temperatures that have occurred over the past 45 years. And that's really important, and it's often overlooked. So just a point to say about being very careful when you're looking at mean values and mean annual changes in air temperatures. Now, I asked a number of my colleagues about this and was concerned that maybe our research site was unique. And what I found out was, and I'd like to hear from others as well, is that across the Canadian prairies, this is very common. In fact, there's been very little change in summer air temperatures, and almost all of the changes that we've seen in past temperature warmings are occurring during the winter period. So it's getting less cold, but it's not necessarily getting hotter during the summer. So it's a very important point to note. Now, this becomes very important when you start to look at global trends in lake surface temperatures during the summer, during the ice-free period. And we contributed data to a global analysis here, and this is looking at temperature change, surface temperature change in freshwater lakes between 1985 and 2009. And that time period was chosen because that's where satellite data was available. And you can see that in most locations around the world, surface water temperatures are increasing during this period. But you see a lot of the sites, especially in our part of North America, are very, very light pink, and the changes are very, very small. So that begs the question about what controls surface water temperature. We haven't seen very large changes, if at all, in summer air temperatures. So would we even expect to see changes in summer water temperatures? And the answer is probably not. The graph on your right is showing the relationship between mean annual air temperature in July on the x-axis and the water temperature in Lake 239 on the July axis, or on the y-axis. And you see they're very tightly correlated. And it's an interesting question because lakes don't actually heat up largely because of air temperature. They heat up because photons from the sun are absorbed by water molecules or other particles in the water. And so they absorb this shortwave radiation and they release long-wave radiation as heat. All right. So what's happening is as they release that long-wave radiation back to the atmosphere, it quickly comes back into balance with whatever air temperatures are. So if air temperatures go up, you lose less heat to the atmosphere. If air temperatures go down, you lose more heat. And so that's why air temperatures and water temperatures are so tightly correlated. So if air temperatures aren't influencing summer water temperatures to any great extent in our region, are air temperatures even important? Is this mean annual air temperature or changes in winter temperature when lakes are ice covered, are they even relevant to lakes? And the answer is yes, they absolutely are. And part of that is because we're seeing a significant decline in the duration of ice cover. So again, this data is from Lake 239, our main reference lake. And what we see is about 4 days per decade increase in the ice-free season, or the period of time when lakes are not ice covered. Now those variations in ice on and ice off dates are highly predictable based on spring and autumn air temperatures. And I'm not showing you the data, but I have it, and it's entirely predictable from those. Now, this brings us to a question, sort of that so what question. Why is ice cover important? And it brings us to an interesting conundrum for cold water fish, and we call it the Goldilocks problem. So this is a figure of lake trout, and that's in the dots, the median values. And what this is fish that are fitted with acoustic tags that we can track where the depth that they're occurring in the water column. And you see that as you move through the season, they go deeper and they stay in these deeper layers. And the reason is that as a cold water fish, they require water temperatures that are below 15 degrees Celsius, and they also require high oxygen environments. So areas with dissolved oxygen above around 6 milligrams per liter. So there's a problem in lakes where when ice cover comes off early and the lakes start to heat up, and you can see that the 15-degree isotherm, or the surface water in a lake, becomes too hot for these lake trout to survive. And that the depth of that 15-degree isocline gets deeper and deeper throughout the summer. And at the bottom of the lake, the opposite thing is going on, is that dissolved oxygen concentrations, because of sediment oxygen demand, it's consuming oxygen, and the bottom waters start to become anoxic. And this is compounded in lakes that receive high anthropogenic nutrient loading. You have a lot of organic matter production in the surface waters of the lake, and that organic matter sinks down to the deep waters of the lake and decomposes and consumes oxygen. And so as the summers become longer and longer, these two, the temperature and the oxygen figures there, they start to overlap, and there starts to become very little habitat left for lake trout. So what does this mean for the future of lake trout in our region? And it's something that's very concerning. And what you're seeing here is a figure of the largest 5% of lake trout in our population. These are the large adults. And what you can see, there's 3 figures there, and they come from 3 different lakes, Lake 373, Lake 224, and Lake 468. And what you can see that over time, these fish are getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and it's fairly consistent between lakes, although the rate of change is different. It's important to know that we haven't detected any significant changes in abundance, in lake trout abundance in these lakes, but what we have seen is reduced adult survival. So we've seen a shift in age classes to younger fish, a shift in length at age, so the fish are getting shorter, and a shift in fitness. So there's reduced biomass per unit length. So these fish are getting younger, shorter, and skinnier. And essentially what's happening is we're losing a lot of those large trophy fish from these lakes over time. So that was one example of sort of the direct effects of temperature on some lake properties and some biological responses. Now, and as I said at the start of the presentation, the effects of climate change on lakes are largely going to be mitigated by relationships with the watershed. And so I wanted to provide an example of that as well. Excuse me. So this is the quote that I showed at the start of the presentation, and this point is certainly recognized by ourselves and many other individuals, is that most of the impacts of climate warming are going to be a result of processes that link terrestrial soils of watersheds to their streams, wetlands, and lakes, rather than the direct effects of temperature. And if that was just a quote and you didn't believe it, I think the point really hits home when you look at some of the agricultural watersheds in Canada. And these are two of our largest lakes in Canada, and in fact largest lakes in the world, that are currently experiencing severe algal blooms during the summer period. So on the left is Lake Winnipeg, and on the right is Lake Erie. Now in both of these cases, changes in land use and how the land is being used is certainly important. But the other contributing factor is that we've been experiencing higher than normal precipitation in both of these watersheds. And what that's doing is pushing phosphorus off the watersheds into these lakes, and we are experiencing severe eutrophication. And this is really important because we have spent billions of dollars in trying to deal with this eutrophication problem by controlling phosphorus loading from point sources. And now we're having this issue of non-point source loading that is very strongly linked to climate. And so how our future, our ability to deal with this problem is going to be strongly linked to the future climate. Now, boreal watersheds are certainly different than agricultural watersheds, and we are looking for different factors. But their interaction is also governed by hydrology, sort of that linkage between the watershed and the lake. So the first question is, as with temperature, is it getting wetter? And the answer is yes, but. And if you had asked me that question in the mid-1990s, I would have said that the region was actually getting drier. There was a wet period in the 1960s and early 1970s that led into a dry period that lasted until the mid-1990s. However, the region has since received a higher than normal amount of precipitation for the last 15 or 20 years. So even though we have a fairly long data set, I think it's important to even look at longer data sets, such as one that comes from a nearby station in Kenora. And that's in the bottom graph, and it's the open points, or the open circles, and the ELA data is located in the dark circles, or the filled-in circles. And you see that we get a little bit more rain and snow than they do in Kenora, but the pattern is the same. And what you see is, especially from the Kenora data, is that the long-term patterns in precipitation appear to follow a wet-dry-wet cycle. All right, and we are currently in a wet period, and it's unknown whether or not that this cycle is going to persist, and if we're going to be heading into a drier than usual period, or if these projections that are occurring from climate cycles or climate models are taking this into account, as in our region they're projecting similar or wetter conditions. So it's important to know that even though our data set looks like it's potentially a linear increase in precipitation, there's actually longer term cycles. And this is why it's important to have these very long time series. Now, given the role of CO2 as a greenhouse gas, there is considerable interest in the carbon cycle and how carbon moves through watersheds, how it's stored, how it's fluxed into the atmosphere. So this is obviously something we're interested in, and given our data on the Lake 239 watershed, we're able to put together a fairly tight mass balance and describe how variations in precipitation alter carbon sequestration and fluxes. And so this is actually a project that we are currently working on with a researcher from the University of Regina. And so we hope to publish that information quite soon. Now, if you've ever looked at a wetland or a marshy area and you've noticed that the water had a brownish or tea color to it, that is actually dissolved organic carbon, or DOC. Now, DOC represents the dominant flux of carbon between watersheds, streams, and lakes. It's an aqueous form of carbon, and it moves quite freely between these zones. Now, in other regions, particularly in areas affected by acid rain, changes in soil chemistry appear to be quite important in DOC loss rates from watersheds. However, in the figures that I'm showing to the left, which are our three inflowing streams into the Lake 239 watershed, you see a fairly tight relationship between total annual precipitation and total annual dissolved organic carbon loading. Now, note on the y-axis that the scales are different between the three different inflowing streams, and this is largely because the watersheds are different sizes. So the east inflow has quite a bit larger watershed than the other two inflows, and if you average these out based on watershed area, the values actually become quite similar to one another. Now, while carbon cycling and sequestration in the boreal zone are certainly important to the global carbon cycle, DOC also plays a really important role in altering ecosystem function. So the graph on the left shows data from a wide range of lakes at the ELA. On the x-axis is DOC concentration, and on the y-axis is water clarity. So it's measured as the depth of 1% light, so that's the depth to which 1% of the irradiance at the surface can penetrate into a lake. So essentially what's happening is under low dissolved organic carbon conditions, water transparency is very high and light can penetrate to very deep depths in our lakes. And an example is somewhere between 25 and 30 meters, you have a lot of light. However, when you get to higher DOC concentrations, you can see that light is attenuated very quickly, and you will only have that depth of 1% light extending to 1 meter or less. So this is a huge variation in water transparency between our lakes. Now, this is where the physics becomes really interesting. Because in high DOC lakes, the photons are scattered and absorbed at shallow depths, so light is absorbed at the shallow depths, that's where most of the energy is stored and the heat is emitted as long-wave radiation. So as a result, lakes with the high DOC concentrations tend to have shallow thermoclines. So that's what the figure on the right is demonstrating. Now, what the figure doesn't show is that lake size is also important. And in very large lakes, other factors start to become important. Even the Earth's rotation and the Coriolis effect has an influence, and DOC starts to become unimportant. But it's important to note that small lakes represent more than 90% of lakes in the world, and they dominate lakes in the boreal zone. So these variations in dissolved organic carbon that are occurring in the boreal zone have a really strong impact on lake physics. Now, I did want to talk a little bit about the impacts to biota as well, and I only have time for a single example here. And this is what I brought up at the start of the presentation, in that it was very important that we were measuring phytoplankton biomass and not just the pigment concentrations or chlorophyll. So what you're seeing here is, on the upper panel is dissolved organic carbon in orange, and the ratio of chlorophyll to biomass in green. And essentially what it's saying is that phytoplankton have the ability to compensate for high DOC or low water clarity by increasing their light harvesting pigments. And because of this, there's really no strong relationships between dissolved organic carbon and primary production. So if you had asked me before I looked at this data and said, oh, there's this dramatic loss of water clarity in lakes when you have high DOC, that must reduce primary production. The answer is it's not so simple as that, and organisms have ability to compensate. That's what makes them so interesting. So we're actually looking at this question as part of an ongoing whole ecosystem experiment. It's called the Lake 626 experiment, where we are manipulating DOC concentrations and looking at the effects on all parts of the food web. So I certainly recognize that this was a whirlwind tour of the LTER program. And what I mean is that, you know, I could only talk about a few of the components in each of these categories or areas that we are examining. But I hope that you found at least a few useful nuggets. And in terms of the data, what I've largely discussed is the historical trends in climate and how they've influenced responses at various levels in the ecosystem. But it's important to note that we're not just looking for the trends, we're also looking to try to understand what the mechanisms are. And I wanted to mention that there's a lot of gaps and things that we haven't I haven't talked about today, and things that we still need to look at. And one of those, as an example, is the effects of fire. Climate change is expected to have dramatic impacts on the degree to which the boreal zone is burned. I've heard projections of dramatic increases in fire propensity in the region. Now, we've had a severe forest fire in the ELA region in the early 1970s, and there was one even more severe in 1980, and it burnt much of our watersheds. The fire was incredibly intense, and it burnt away almost all of the soil and exposed bedrock. And so you can imagine here that there's a large potential to alter water yields and the delivery of elements to aquatic ecosystems. Certainly in this scenario, the terrestrial zone for the next decade or so as the forest recovers is going to not intercept the nutrients that it did in the past, or the water. And I wanted to leave you with a final thought today, and that although we've been discussing the historical trends, that the future is not simply an extension of the past. The regional climate projections that we have for our area suggest that the future is going to diverge from the historical trends. And so that's the figure I'm showing on the left. The lines that you see is the changes in summer air temperature over time, and there's really no strong trend there. But you can see the projections for 2050 and 2070 for the two different scenarios. Even with the modest Paris scenario, the RCP 2.6 scenario, we're seeing about a 2-degree temperature increase during the summer period. And under the business as usual approach, we're seeing even larger increases in summer temperature than that. So we're heading into a new climate envelope, and we're going to be learning new things, and our experiences from the past, at least the trends, are going to be different. We're going to be heading into a new place. And so this is why understanding the mechanisms are so important. And if there was any takeaway message from that, I would say that there's a really strong need for the development and coupling of robust mechanistic models with climate projections and whole ecosystem experiments. And that isn't just in terms of lake models. I think we need to do a better job at linking our lakes to our watersheds, because this is going to be largely where the impacts are being felt. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. A lot of great information and opportunities presented here today. Thank you very much. At this time, I would like to ask the audience to type any questions or comments that they might have. I will give you a couple of moments to do that, and in the meantime, I will ask a couple of questions that we've already received. Okay, so from Kay Stinson, the question is, how will the lakes that have chemicals added to them be remediated when the research is complete? And are precautions taken to prevent the contamination beyond the research site?
Yes, that's a very good question, and even to back up from that, I'd like to say that all of our experiments go through a research advisory board, which includes representatives from the province of Ontario and a number of scientists that sort of understand how these boreal lakes function, and so they have to pass an approval process first. And no experiments undertaken where we believe that remediation is not possible, or where we believe there's a threat to human health. Now, in most cases, what happens is these lakes remediate naturally on their own. It's very rare where we have had to go in and remediate the lakes using some other technique. There is an example, though. One of them is the Lake 302 experiment, where we did an acid rain study. So essentially, we lowered the pH of the lake down to below 5. And what that did is it eradicated a number of species in the lake. And we were hoping that, this lake is connected to other lakes, and we were anticipated that the lake would be recolonized as its pH returned to background levels. Now that pH in that lake has recovered for several decades, but there are a few species that are not present. And so we're actually intending to undertake an experiment. We have a proposal now to reintroduce those species back into that lake.
From S. Gurney, are climate change trends seen in the ELA in any way expected to affect the concentration of calcium levels through runoff, precipitation extremes, fires, etc., in lakes, and in turn affect zebra mussel populations?
Right, so that's a really good question. So as some of you may know, zebra mussels have recently invaded into Manitoba, into Lake Winnipeg, and some of the surrounding tributaries, the Red River and Cedar Lake. And so the boreal shield is just to the east of that, and it's just on the doorstep of zebra mussel invasion, and is potentially could be invaded by zebra mussels. Now, calcium concentrations currently are too low to support zebra mussels in this whole region. So essentially, as you move to the east of Lake Winnipeg and onto the Canadian Shield, lakes have fairly low calcium concentrations and simply just can't support them. There's no evidence to suggest that climate change in this region is going to increase calcium concentrations significantly, and certainly not to the point where these systems would be susceptible to zebra mussels.
Jay Friesen asks, have you considered extending further back in history the observation of the wet, dry, wet cycles? Methods might include tree ring survey or others.
That's a really good question, and this is a bit what I was trying to get at the start of my talk, is that we have been very focused since our inception on aquatic systems, and we haven't done a lot of work in terrestrial systems. You have to imagine that until recently we were part of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and their mandate is quite clearly it's fish. And so anytime we move away from that, we would have to justify very clearly why we were doing it. So no, we haven't looked at terrestrial cores or tree ring cores or things like that. We have had collaborators that have come in and done paleo cores, so cores of lake sediments, and looked at the long-term patterns there. So Brian Cummings is an example. He's out of Queen's University, and I believe he's published some papers on the long-term, and when I say long-term, we're talking thousands of years, changes that we have seen in these lakes.
C. Bartha asks, is there any way to determine how much of the forest cover surrounding lakes affects, or determines the lake conditions, Say, for example, if some were to be removed, that is a buffer analysis. How can that be studied without removing the pristineness of the watershed study area?
Well, that's a really good question, and I think this speaks to our ability to conduct whole ecosystem experiments. Now, we haven't done any experiments directly on the effects of forestry, for example, and buffer strips on lakes. We have had some casual conversations with researchers who are focusing on forestry and discuss that possibility. We haven't done that yet. I did mention that we did have that severe forest fire that burnt huge swaths of the forest away in 1980. And looking at satellite photos shortly after that fire, you could see that huge regions were just completely burned right down to the bedrock. So I think we have a postdoc here right now that's looking at how the Lake 239 watershed, the linkages between the watershed and the lake, and how that was influenced by that fire and the recovery period as the forest started to regrow. So it's a good question. We're looking for collaborations on that front. We're doing a little bit of work. Certainly more would be needed.
P. Doyle asks, has there been any monitoring of snow depths on lakes where the ice on, ice off dates data has been collected?
Yes, so we monitor snow depth in a couple different ways. So we measure it at our meteorological site, and I believe that's measured at a high frequency, so it's either daily or weekly. On the lakes themselves, it's not at that high frequency. We typically go and measure, have a winter limnology program that's a survey base, so we measure it twice per year. And in those cases, yes, we measure snow depth. We also cut a hole in the ice and we look at ice depth and then the different kinds of ice, so white ice, black ice, slush, snow, but it's not as frequently.
R. Herman says, thanks, Scott. You touched upon how larger fish will be impacted by longer anoxic conditions. I assume from thermocline formation. Is there any sense how longer thermocline formation will impact on nutrient cycling and boreal lake vulnerability who have low buffering capacity?
Well, that's a really good question, and it's something we're looking at now, but it's a real challenge. You know, these lakes are pristine lakes, and they have very, very low nutrient concentrations. In fact, our chemistry lab has had to develop new methods that have extremely high sensitivity to measure some of these elements in these lakes. So when we're talking about extending this summer period longer and longer, we can expect that these nutrients are going to be slowly lost from the surface layers through sedimentation and deposition. So I think it's happening. So far, it's been a challenge to tease that out of the data, though.
S. Cowan asks, could you elaborate more on the direct impacts of some of the findings from the ELA on provincial and federal policies and regulations?
Sure, that's a really good question. And it's a tough one to answer because there's potentially a lot, but that is what our research program is designed to do. In both the long-term or the whole ecosystem experiments and our long-term monitoring program, we're trying to do science that influences policy and management. Now, I think one example that I gave in the talk was on this really strong connections between watersheds and their lakes. And essentially what we're seeing is that lakes, with these future changes in climate, lakes are becoming more susceptible to how we use the land. You know, it's quite obvious in agricultural landscapes where these increased precipitation scenarios have been associated with severe eutrophication in many of our lakes, and it's going to be a real challenge to deal with that. And it's going to take some innovative policies, and it's going to take some important thinking, but it's a real problem and we have to deal with it. Another example may be on the fishery side. This region, is already at the southern boundary of lake trout habitat, and climate change it's a real concern that we may lose a lot of lake trout lakes to climate change. And so when you're thinking about how to promote fisheries, recreational fisheries, and stocking programs, I think you really need to take into account the future and what that future is going to look like. There's no point beating a dead horse. I think you need to capitalize on the things that are doing well and try to prevent or slow down the effects on other things. And so, just as an example of that, although I discussed lake trout and these cold water fish that are declining, there's expected to be gains in warm water fish, such as smallmouth bass or perch. And so we may want to focus our fishery more in those areas in the future.
L. Zhang asks, has there been any research on soil and topsoil conservation in relation to ELA? Any potential research focus?
That's a good question. I think the answer is no. The soils in our region are really shallow. They're typically in most areas only a few centimeters deep. There are certainly depressions in the landscape where there are wetlands and peatlands where soils are deeper. But no, and we've had these fires that have come through that have burnt away soils, and now they're regenerating over time. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and I see, since we moved to the IISD, and we see that the scope of our research is expanding, and we're looking for partners, especially in the terrestrial side of things that can bring to us sort of the expertise that we don't have. So we are primarily a group of lake scientists and hydrologists. And so we're looking to outside groups to try to help us with the terrestrial components.
See, Bartha says, referencing your last sentiments, Dr. Higgins, we were told that western prairie pothole landscapes are particularly prone to eutrophication, shallow lakes, drier seasonal conditions, aggressive use of fertilizers, and predominant farming land use in rural areas. Given this, what might be advised about pursuing an even more aggressive approach toward land use management impacts? Alberta, for example, is looking now at better lake management strategies and looking at leveraging the regional planning and municipal planning processes.
Yeah, sure. That's a really great question. And I'm going to give the analogy here to Lake Winnipeg. I think maybe actually there's two components here. One, I think the first thing that I would say is that it's important to look, as we're looking into the future, it is important to look back into the past and try to understand if these lakes or potholes, if these algal problems or eutrophication problems are systemic in the sense that they've occurred for the past 100 or 200 years. In trying to improve the water quality conditions in these lakes, you may be fighting against nature. These lakes may have always been eutrophic, so it's important to do paleocores and to look back. I think that would be the first step. Now, the second component is that, this is largely about phosphorus loading to these lakes. And I indicated in the presentation this real importance of hydrology that's linking the two. And so, as we look into the future and into climate change, I think what we need to do is consider how much water is going to be coming in terms of precipitation and when. And what we may want to be thinking about is trying to hold back water on the landscape for longer periods of time before it gets into the streams and the waterways that flow into our lakes. This may be very beneficial for farmers as well, because if we have drier summer conditions, they may want to be able to access this water for irrigation. And at the same time, what it's doing is sedimenting phosphorus out and releasing less into our streams and into our lakes. So I think there's a number of components there. It's going to require some modeling. It's going to require some looking back into the past as well.
Fantastic. The CWRA would like to thank Dr. Scott Higgins and the IISD ELA for their time today. Please feel free to contact myself directly if you have any other questions. My email address can be seen in the chat window. There is a possibility for one or more follow-up events to this one that would provide a more detailed, in-depth analysis of what you've heard today. If you would be interested, please let us know. You will have the opportunity to comment and respond in a follow-up email sent out shortly. And finally, thank you to everyone for attending today and asking these great questions. If you found the presentations informative and want to receive notice for future events, please go to our website at cwra.org to sign up for our newsletter or become a member and get discounted rates on upcoming conferences, workshops, and online events. One of our next webinar events will feature Create H2O Director Annemieke Fahrenhorst. She will discuss First Nations drinking water challenges. Details and info to register will be found in our newsletter and our Twitter feed at CWRA_flows. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Dr. Higgins, and have a great day.
Great. Thanks, Jody.
Thank you. It was great. Great discussion as well.
Yeah, it was. That was great. Okay, well, I'll go through the presentation and see whether or not I need to call out any slides or any information, and I'll get back to you with that this afternoon.
Sounds great. We'll talk to you shortly.
Okay, thanks. Have a great day.
Yeah, you too. Bye-bye.